I thought we were building a life together. But my wife's betrayal with the President of the United States. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Welcome to my world of political intrigue, secret pacts, and a marriage that was nothing but a front. Subscribe to our channel for the full scoop on this scandal that's shaking the nation. There wasn't a cloud in the early spring sky. The gardeners had grown the grass long, thick and green, in anticipation of today's invasion of 3-0 people. What a great day for an Easter egg roll, I thought, as my wife, Emily, and I carefully crossed the Thompson mansion lawn. I was worried about Emily's safety among the crowd of children and their parents that filled the area. Emily insisted she felt fine and that her pregnancy wouldn't be a problem. Still, I held her expanding waist tightly and kept a close eye on any overly excited child who might bump into her in their search for the brightly decorated eggs. We were also hatching our own egg, I thought proudly. Suddenly screams were heard ahead and the crowd moved toward the source. Applause and laughter filled the air as the mass of people parted to reveal Michael Andrew Stevens, President of the United States. The man whom Time magazine had named America's best salesman in its Person of the Year issue, wore a bunny costume, including a tail and long ears. Secret Service agents tried unsuccessfully to hold back the crowd as the president waved to Emily and me and shouted, "How is my beloved doing today?" Emily smiled widely and gave him a thumbs up. He smiled back at her and then began jumping around in a circle to the delight of the children. I had to admire it. Only Adam Carter could pull off something like this, I thought to myself. The president continued to move through the crowd, and I was pleased to note that there were almost as many photographers as there were children following him. I smiled. Reluctantly. The man really knew how to create a photo moment for himself. Emily spotted some Thompson mansion staffers. She knew in the crowd, and we began to make our way in their direction. Suddenly, he screamed sharply and doubled over. Then she groaned and collapsed to the ground. In front of my frightened eyes, I quickly crouched down next to her, trying to support her head. "What's wrong? Honey, what's wrong?" I asked urgently, but Emily seemed to be in such pain that she couldn't even speak. To my horror, I noticed a dark red stain on the skirt of her Easter dress. In fear and anguish, I raised my head and began screaming madly. "We need help. We need a doctor." The crowd that had gathered around us suddenly parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and the president himself stood over us. The big man turned to the black-suited Secret Service agent and barked, "Take her to the helipad. Launch the medical units and tell them I want her taken to Lincoln Medical Center. Do it now." As if by magic, 3 more agents suddenly appeared around Emily, pushing me aside. They picked her up and began running through the crowd with me trying to keep up. The journey across the Thompson mansion lawns seemed like an eternity to me, but in fact they covered the distance in less than 3 minutes. Even with the crowds of people filling the lawn. The large rods of the Sikorsky 76 helicopter had already begun to spin, and the agents quickly placed Emily inside. As I ran to catch up, a strong arm reached out and literally pulled me into the helicopter. Just as the wheels began to leave the ground, I saw Emily lying on several seats and moved over to her to take her hand. The engine noise died down as soon as the door closed, but I still heard the roar in my ears holding Emily's hand. I looked out the window and saw rooftops and buildings I didn't recognize flying by below us, creating a dizzying effect. Once again, the trip seemed like an eternity to me, but suddenly the medical unit was hovering over the helipad on the roof of the Brady building at Lincoln Medical Center. The stretcher team waited, and as soon as the large helicopter landed, they quickly carried Emily off the helipad and across the ramp to another building where the elevator waited. I tried to follow her, but the paramedics moved so quickly that I was left behind. After agonizing minutes on the roof, the elevator returned and the hospital employee stepped out and escorted me to the correct floor and through a maze of corridors to the waiting room. For the next hours, I alternated between sitting and walking around the waiting room. Finally, a figure in a white coat walked up to the front desk and said loudly, "Phillips. Mr. Jacob Phillips." I stood up and hurried toward the woman. "How is she?" I asked urgently. The doctor calmly led me down the corridor away from the waiting room, so we could talk a little alone. "Mr. Phillips, I'm Drive Sophia Bennett, your wife's gynecologist. Your wife is out of danger," she said softly. "We're going to keep her overnight for observation, but if nothing unexpected happens, you can take her home." In the morning I released the breath I had been holding and tears of gratitude appeared in my eyes. But my relief was short-lived and the child doctor. "What's wrong with the child?" The doctor looked at me without expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but your wife lost her baby. She suffered a miscarriage." I felt as if I had been stabbed in the chest. "Oh God, why did this happen?" The doctor looked at me with sympathy. "Mr. Phillips, it's important that you understand that neither you nor your wife did anything wrong. In fact, 15 to 20 of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, and that's as if the woman knows she's pregnant. An even higher percentage of mothers suffer spontaneous miscarriages without even realizing they are pregnant." She stroked my hand. "The most important thing right now is that there is nothing stopping you and your wife from trying to conceive again. Many women who have miscarriages get pregnant again and have healthy, normal children. It's not the end of the world." I nodded, still devastated over the loss of our child, but somewhat comforted by the doctor's words. "And Emily, can I see her?" "We gave her a sedative to help her sleep, but you can stop by and see her if you want," the doctor replied. I followed the doctor into Emily's room and cautiously peered through the door, seeing my wife sleeping. I crept up to her face, looked tired, but to me she was the most beautiful woman in the world. I kissed her forehead. "I love you, darling. We will get through this," I whispered, then turned and left. When I finally returned home to Falls Church, it was dark. Even though I hadn't eaten anything since morning, I couldn't bring myself to eat or even think about food. Instead, I walked out onto our deck and collapsed into a chair to stare into the darkness. Now that I knew Emily was safe and cared for, my own pain returned, along with a lot of memories. I had been dreaming about having a baby for a long time, even longer than Emily. She insisted that we both should establish our career before starting a family. Then she finally agreed that the time was right. She didn't get pregnant right away. Doctors declared us both healthy and fully capable of having children. Patience, a lot of practice were the only recommendations for us. Now that lightning had finally struck and Emily was pregnant, it was meant to be. As the night air grew colder, I began to remember how Emily and I met. I had just received my law degree from the University of Missouri, but instead of committing myself to a job at a law firm, I decided to try out the political process. I wasn't interested in running for office myself, but I wanted to work for a candidate and try to make a difference. The candidate I chose to work for was a promising recruit from Kansas named Adam Carter. What struck me about Stevens was the way he combined a populist agenda with political pragmatism. Adam seemed to have a talent for bringing political opponents together to work out compromises acceptable to both sides. The fact that Adam was also young and from another prairie state finally convinced me. Stevens had just begun his campaign for his party's nomination, and I arrived at his campaign headquarters in Kansas City to volunteer. When I asked a college student who was in charge, the young man nodded toward a panoramic glass office. Amid a bustle of workers, wall posters, phone banks, and other campaign paraphernalia, a blonde stood in the center of the office, talking on the phone with enthusiasm. I looked at her in amazement. She wasn't a model, but I considered her the most attractive woman I had ever seen. I walked up to the office and waited by the door until she hung up and noticed me. "Well, who are you and what do you need?" she demanded. "I am Michael," I muttered, "and I'm here to volunteer." "Great," she said and grabbed a piece of paper from her desk to hand it to me. "Here's a list of 50 potential donors. Call them and ask for the specified amount. And don't take no for an answer." As I stood looking at her in admiration, she waved the list impatiently in front of my face. "Come on, get started," she said. I blushed. took the paper from her, and walked over to the row of phones to start ringing. Later that night, when everything had calmed down, I returned to the office. The young woman had taken off her shoes and was sitting with her feet on the table, clearly tired. I found her even more attractive than at first glance. She felt my presence and looked at me with irritation. "Well, have you called all these donors?" she asked sternly. "Yes," I confirmed, "and I've received some promises of help." The woman's face relaxed. "Good job," she said, as if to a child. "If you can come tomorrow, we still have a lot of calls to make." I paced the room nervously. I was actually hoping to do something more meaningful for the campaign. She looked at me suspiciously. "And what do you think you're qualified to do?" "Well, I said. The woman jumped to her feet and looked at me with regret. "Oh God, why didn't you tell me right away? We desperately need legal counsel." "Sit down and tell me about yourself." This is how our acquaintance began. Emily, who had been working with Stevens when he was a U.S. representative from Kansas, had taken on an increasingly larger role in the campaign, as had I at first. Emily insisted that our relationship remain strictly professional. It was a difficult time for me, but things got better after Stevens returned to Kansas on the campaign trail and made a point of meeting with the lawyer Emily had talked so much about. With his friendly style and strong personality, Stevens strengthened my support and increased my loyalty. In turn, I must have made a favorable impression, because Emily then let me know how impressed Stevens was with our meeting. After this, Emily warmed up to me and we began dating outside of work almost immediately. We married shortly after the general election tie-in. After the election, Stevens's campaign became the object of study by political scientists. Coming from a state with little influence in Congress, Stevens had little national recognition when he started his campaign. His performance in the primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire was weak and he was widely expected to withdraw from the race. But he did much better in the Colorado and Minnesota caucuses and then began to gain real momentum in southern states. It was tough for a while, but impressive wins in the New England states put him in the lead when he easily won the California primary. The nomination was his Stevens' strength in New England was no fluke. At Yale Law School, he met and successfully attracted Samantha Hamilton, who was not only a descendant of Alexander Hamilton, but also the daughter of Horace Hamilton, the senior senator from Massachusetts. One observer called their marriage less a love affair than a union of political dynasties. In any case, there was no doubt that the senator's influence played a significant role in Stevens winning the nomination. In contrast, the general election went smoothly. The opposition candidate was the vice president of the previous administration, long involved in politics. The vice president had many connections but limited skills on the ballot. The photogenic Adam Carter won over the electorate with his humor, personal charm and tireless energy. The final voting result was the second largest truth in history. It was obvious that Emily and I would go to Washington to become part of the administration. I even wondered if my wife might be offered a cabinet position, but she didn't want to deal with it. Instead, she became one of Stevens' closest aides, whom he relied on working loyally behind the scenes to make Stevens' star shine even brighter. It was a role she loved. I decided not to enter the administration, choosing to work at a large law firm in the Washington area. One of us needs to make money and live a normal life, I told Emily with a smile, and although I didn't tell her by that time, I had become a little wary of the absolute loyalty that Stevens expected from his men. Adam may have believed in the art of compromise, but he was not receptive to disagreements within his administration. I voted for Stevens' re-election, but I no longer idealized him, as I once did. Michael suddenly shouted, which brought him out of his thoughts. A glance at the thermometer in the backyard showed the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees. As he sat there reminiscing spring nights in Washington can still get pretty cold. He reminded himself as he walked back into the house soon after he went to bed, setting his alarm to wake up early enough to get to Baltimore and Hopkins on time the next day. When I arrived at Emily's room in the morning, I found her awake and sitting up in bed. her face illuminated by the bright April sun. But her expression was depressed and her eyes reflected the emotional pain of losing our child. I rushed to her and hugged her tightly, but she returned my hug weakly. Her lack of warmth was painful, but I reminded myself that any pain I felt must be many times greater for Emily. Trying to get her involved, I pointed to a huge arrangement of flowers that took up an entire corner of the room. "They are beautiful. Where are they from?" "I asked from the White House," was all Emily replied, so I walked over to look at the card. The flowers were indeed from the President and First Lady, both of whom personally signed wishes for Emily's speedy recovery. I called the hospital to make sure I could take Emily home. The nurse advised me to bring a change of clothes for my wife now that I had handed her the bag. She asked me to leave the room, while she changed her request but I complied without protest. As I left the room, I met Emily's gynecologist again doing her rounds. "Your wife is recovering well," Clive Lewis assured me, "but there are a few things you need to understand. Losing a child is not only emotionally traumatic for a woman, but also physically traumatic." When she became pregnant, Emily's body began a complex series of hormonal changes, preparing for pregnancy, birth and breastfeeding. These changes were abruptly interrupted by the miscarriage and must now begin the reverse process. This process, along with all the emotions she is going through, will make this a difficult time for her. I would advise you to be as patient as possible and supportive over the next few weeks, because your wife will really need it. The good news is that most women recover physically quite quickly. However, the emotional side may take longer. In these cases, time is the best healer, and I expect it won't take too long for her mood and general condition to noticeably improve. If this doesn't happen, there are medications I can prescribe to help her return to a more normal state of mind. The doctor warily pushed her grey bangs back from her forehead and looked carefully at me. "Your wife really needs you. Will have to be patient and caring now more than ever." As I drove Emily home, the doctor's words continued to echo in my head, and I made a promise to myself that I would do everything I could to help my wife heal. The following days were some of the most difficult I had ever faced. I still had to deal with my own sadness over the loss of our unborn child, but my natural optimism kept me afloat. I clung to the hope that Emily and I could try again and maybe have better luck this time. However, with Emily, it was different. She spent most of the next few days at home in her room, only leaving when absolutely necessary, and when she did, she barely spoke to me. A week later, she stated that she had fully recovered and insisted on returning to work. But from an emotional point of view, it was a different story. She performed all her personal and work functions normally, but did so without showing any emotion. She continued to spend long periods alone, brooding, and shied away from my touch every time I tried to hug or comfort her. She recoiled. As my own sadness subsided, my concern for Emily continued to grow. It was as if the woman I loved had been replaced by an impenetrable, emotional and uncaring stranger. My anxiety increased and I turned to my friends for advice, asking for their opinions and recommendations. They all agreed that Emily was showing symptoms of depression, and everyone assured me that patience and loving care were my best strategies. The continued loss of intimacy and emotional connection was having an increasing impact on me. But after 2 months, the lack of intimate activity also began to seriously bother me. One night I carefully broached the topic of resuming our intimate life, with disastrous consequences. Emily looked at me in shock and exclaimed, "If I never have sex with you again, I will die." A happy woman, she then burst into tears and ran into our room, slamming the door and locking it. Intellectually, I knew she didn't mean what she said, but her words still hurt me. As I lay on the couch that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't help but think about our intimate life together. Emily had never been a very passionate woman. My libido had always been stronger than hers. It was disappointing to me that she had a lower level of desire, but I loved her so much that I was willing to accept her for who she was. Then we made love. It was almost exciting for me. Another thing I discovered about Emily was that, Unlike the women I had known before, she wasn't particularly interested in foreplay. All this thinking about sex only increased my frustration, and I decided that I had to take some action. After much thought, I decided to try to make an appointment with Drive Lewis and ask her for help. The next morning I called Drive Lewis' office and asked for an appointment. I was pleasantly surprised when the nurse came back on the line and said the doctor could see me. At the end of the day, and I saw Dr. Lewis, I wasted no time in immediately laying out my wife's situation as I saw it, describing the list of problems and symptoms I had observed. The doctor nodded as she listened, and when I finished, she told me that Emily's symptoms, while not unprecedented, were on the more extreme end of typical reactions after a miscarriage. It looks like Emily is suffering from postpartum depression, she told me when I looked confused. She explained you're used to hearing this term in connection with mothers who carry a baby to term and then suffer from postpartum depression. But it can also happen in women who have had a miscarriage, and the symptoms they are experiencing may be just as severe given the circumstances. I will put her on Prozac. I like how it works, because it seems to work faster than some of the newer antidepressants. As she wrote the prescription, my long-repressed sense of loss resurfaced till I threw up my hands. I still don't understand how we could have lost the baby. We're both healthy. We ate healthy. Emily was careful to avoid alcohol and drugs. But went wrong. Drive Lewis looked at me with sympathy. It's so hard to tell. In cases like this, Mr. Phillips, it could be a chromosome abnormality or an inappropriate immunological reaction. Your wife's abortion could play a role. Or undiagnosed. Wait a minute. I interrupted her. Abortion? My wife Emily never had an abortion. Of course she did, he writ, as the doctor said, flipping through a file on her desk. She had a vacuum aspiration abortion on February 2nd, 2 years ago. I didn't know anything about an abortion. Show me this, I demanded, reaching across the table for the documents. Drive Lewis abruptly snatched the file from my hands and quickly closed it. I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act absolutely prohibits me from sharing Emily's medical records with you or anyone else without her express written permission. But I am her husband. I exclaimed. It was my child who was aborted. I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, but my hands are tied. When I returned home from Baltimore, I was upset and confused. Each thought gave rise to more and more questions. How could Emily have had an abortion without telling me? Why did she do it when we were trying so hard to have a baby? Why did she hide it from me? If she hadn't had an abortion, would I have become a father already? Arriving home, I discovered that I had arrived before Emily, always a workaholic. Emily had started staying longer and longer at work after her miscarriage, and I now wondered if she was deliberately trying to avoid me. It was almost 8:00 p.m. when I heard her car pull up to the house. I spent the entire time thinking about what I learned from Drive Lewis, and by this point I was very upset. When Emily entered into the house, I immediately confronted her. Why did you have an abortion 2 years ago? I demanded. Emily's eyes widened and her face turned red. But I never had an abortion. Who told you that? She exclaimed. I saw Drive Lewis today. She told me. I replied. She's lying. Emily shouted. It's not true. She then rushed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. I followed her, but heard her sobs through the door. I returned to the living room and fell onto the sofa, holding my head in my hands. What the hell is going on? I asked myself in despair. Emily never left her room that evening and the door remained locked. The next morning I had to go to work in the same clothes as the door remained locked. Luckily, I had a toothbrush and razor in the office, so I was able to make myself somewhat presentable. But my appearance did not reflect my emotional state, and I did very little work. At the end of the working day, I cautiously headed home, not knowing what awaited me in my once happy home. To my surprise, Emily was already at home and greeted me politely as if nothing had happened. We ate dinner together, but I could feel acid building in my stomach. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I began cautiously. Honey, we need to talk. I began over dinner. There's nothing to talk about. Emily interrupted me calmly. I didn't have an abortion, and that's all you need to know now. If you'll excuse me, I have some work to do with that. She stood up from the table, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. Over the next 2 days, I tried to raise the issue once more, only to hear the exact same answer. There was no abortion. Finally, I decided to try a different approach. With my wife, Honey, I began over dinner. I know you're feeling terrible about the miscarriage. And I saw Dr. Lays. She gave me a prescription that she said would help. And I handed her the prescription. She took it and then looked at me blankly. Thank you, Jacob, but that's not necessary. I have fully recovered from my depression. With that, she tore up the prescription, threw the pieces into the trash and went into the living room to read while Emily slept next to me late that night. I lay unable to sleep, constantly asking myself, what should I do now? I still couldn't find the answer. I knew I felt worse than the day we lost the child in the morning. Looking at myself in the mirror, the dark circles under my eyes cleared how little sleep I had gotten. Still, I forced myself to get dressed and go to work, if for no other reason than simply because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I ate a sandwich at my desk at noon, but then couldn't remember which one it was later. My self-pity was interrupted by my secretary, who informed me that I had a visitor from the White House. Surprised, I asked her to let the guest in and then stood up waiting at my desk, wondering who might have come and why. When the secretary returned, she was accompanied by an attractive woman who seemed to be about my age. She was of average height, with dark short cropped hair, and she was wearing a stylish suit. I couldn't help but notice that she looked very sporty. The woman came up and introduced herself. My name is Evelyn Hughes, she said, extending her hand to me. I'm from the U.S. Secret Service. I motioned for her to sit and then politely but curiously asked, how may I help you? Miss Simmons. Mr. Phillips, I am seconded to the First Lady and I am here on her behalf. Mrs. Stevens would like to meet with you today if possible. I was so stunned that I rudely blurted out, why does the First Lady want to see me? The agent smiled and replied, the First Lady should tell you that. Sir, not me. I looked at her warily. When would she like this meeting to take place? The agent smiled again and said, now. If possible, sir, or as soon as you can. I have been instructed to wait for you and take you to the White House. I was puzzled by this strange turn of events, but decided I had nothing to lose by agreeing to accompany the Secret Service agent. After telling my secretary where I was going and seeing her nod, we headed to the White House. Upon arrival, I was ushered onto the sidewalk where a black Escalade was parked. Agent Simmons got behind the wheel and motioned for me to take next to her. As we slowly made our way through Washington's traffic jams, the agent looked at me and said, let me express my condolences for the loss of your child. Surprised, I thanked her and then asked, so you know about this? Yes, sir. I was on duty on Easter Monday. I was one of the agents who carried your wife to the helicopter. Oh, I didn't know. I said awkwardly. I mean, I didn't really pay attention to anything else. Anyway, thanks for everything you did to help us. It's okay, sir, she said in a professional tone. Besides, I hope to be a mother someday too. You have a husband? I asked and then wondered if I had said something wrong, but the agent smiled at me and shook her head. No, I'm still searching. I thought I found the right one once, but he turned out to be frivolous. But that's okay. I'll find my happiness. At that point we turned onto East Executive Avenue, and after Agent Simmons showed her credentials at the gate, we were allowed to drive up to the East Wing entrance. Simmons led me upstairs to the second floor, where the First Lady's office was located, approaching the mezzanine. The agent knocked lightly on the door and then led me inside there. I found the First Lady busy at her desk. She stood up and walked around to shake my hand. Mrs. Stevens, I said, bowing slightly. She smiled graciously and led me to the sofa and chairs on one side of the work area. We'll be more comfortable talking here, she said as we sat down. Her expression became more serious. How is your wife, Mr. Phillips? She asked softly. Has she recovered from her loss? I hesitated, not sure how to respond, given everything that had happened. In the end, I took the easy way out and said she's doing as well as can be expected. Ma'am, thank you for asking. The First Lady nodded and then looked closely at me. What about you, Michael? How are you feeling? To my surprise, my throat felt tight and I tried to cover it up with a small cough. It wasn't easy. Ma'am, I really wanted to be a father. She reached out and lightly stroked my arm. Men are always supposed to be strong and silent. It's easy to forget that they have feelings too. I nodded gratefully, not knowing what else to say. She pointed to the coffee set on the table in front of us and asked if I would like to join her for a cup of coffee. I agreed, grateful for the opportunity to keep my hands busy, after she poured us both a cup. Mrs. Stevens took a sip and, looking over the rim of her cup, asked Michael, "So what do you think of my husband?" I froze, holding the cup halfway to my mouth, desperately trying to figure out how to respond. In the end, I chose a cautious answer. As you know, I volunteered for his first presidential election. I said. The First Lady glared at me. Yes, and I know you didn't volunteer for his re-election. Either way, he didn't really answer my question. Michael. I took a sip from my cup to give myself more time to think, but still felt unsure of what to say in the end. I decided to be sincere. The president has achieved some remarkable accomplishments. Mrs. Stevens, I said, he overcame a budget in Congress when no one thought it was possible, and I think he handled the crisis in Southeast Asia well. Mrs. Stevens listened intently, but I sighed to myself. But it bothers me that lately it's all about Adam Carter and not the country. I think he's acting more like a king than a president, like he's promoting a cult of personality. There's even talk of repealing the 22nd Amendment so he could be running for a third term, and they say the president is pushing it behind the scenes. All of this makes me feel uneasy. I placed the cup on the table and leaned back, waiting for her reaction. Very interesting, replied the First Lady. She took another sip of her coffee and then looked at me again. What are your views on marriage, Michael? Do you agree with the growing number of young people who seem to want to live together permanently without officially getting married? And for those who do get married, what about the trend of looking for relationships outside of marriage? I was taken aback by the sudden change of topic, but this time I had no hesitation in answering Mrs. Stevens. I'm probably old-fashioned in this regard. I think that people who live together for years without marriage are afraid to commit. I believe that commitment is necessary for a successful relationship, especially if the couple plans to have children. And as for all these services for finding extramarital affairs, I think they are pretty low. She put down her cup and looked at me carefully. Have you ever been unfaithful to Emily? I was clearly offended. No, ma'am, I haven't and I never will. So you've never even been tempted? I can't say no, ma'am. But there is a big difference between experiencing temptation and acting on temptation. She looked at me for a long time and then suddenly stood up as I hurried to follow her example. She extended a hand to me. You're a good person, Michael. It's been nice getting to know you a little better. Unfortunately, I have my next appointment, but I hope we have a chance to talk again. As I shook her hand, Evelyn Hughes appeared as if by magic to escort me to the door. Mrs. Stevens stopped us. Michael, take care of yourself. Okay. I smiled. Yes, ma'am. I'll try and thank you. With that, Agent Simmons escorted me from the White House to a waiting car. I was silent until we pulled out onto the street. Then I turned to the woman. Have you been listening to our entire conversation? She smiled. Yes, Mrs. Stevens prefers that I remain alert, with both ears and eyes. She feels safer this way. Well, all I can say is that this was the weirdest conversation I've ever had. I have no idea why she wanted to see me, I said, overcome with confusion. Evelyn looked at me. In my experience, Miss Stevens is a fairly astute judge of character, but she prefers to form her opinions based on her own observation. I don't know why she wants to know more about you, but I would say that you have passed the test. Whatever it is. I just shook my head in confusion. Suddenly my life seemed to spin out of control due to a dramatic turn of events. First a miscarriage, then Emily's depression, a shocking revelation from a doctor, and now a sudden call from the First Lady. I felt as if my carefully planned life had suddenly been thrown out of whack. Of course now I had no control over where I was going or what might happen next. That evening I told Emily about my visit to the White House, and I was glad that she showed interest in what had happened. She wanted to know what the First Lady said and why she wanted to meet with me, but I couldn't provide any answers to the last question, and Emily was just as confused as I was, seeing Emily more animated than she had been lately. I cautiously tried to return to the topic of what happened 2 years ago, but as soon as I raised the issue, she again reacted with the comical denial that such a thing had ever happened, and her mood turned into barely contained hostility. Realizing that nothing could be achieved, I went into the living room and tried to concentrate on the work I had brought home with me, but with all the questions swirling around my head, it was impossible to concentrate. Ultimately, I decided that I needed to see Drive Lewis again. Even if she didn't show me Emily's medical records, I at least hoped to get a professional opinion on Emily's denials. The next morning I went to work at my usual time, but after visiting my secretary, I got back into the car and headed to Baltimore to Lincoln Medical Center. The traffic was particularly heavy, and I believed there must be a traffic accident ahead when I noticed a police helicopter flying over a row of cars. Accordingly, I left the highway and took an alternative route using side streets. Arriving at Lincoln Medical Center, I went straight to Drive Lewis' office, but when I asked to see her, the receptionist looked at me with confusion. "Did you have an appointment?" So she asked. "No, my wife is a patient." I was hoping she could spare some time for me, I replied, "but she's not here." She said, "When is she coming back? If it doesn't take long, maybe he'll just wait for her." I added, "We actually don't know when she'll be back," the receptionist said apologetically. Drive Lewis took a leave of absence. I think she went to China, though I'm not sure. We were simply told to cancel all existing appointments and not make new ones, until we received further instructions. I thanked the young woman and turned desperate to leave. What should I do now? I asked myself. I felt as if every possible path was blocked from me, and I found myself in a limbo of ignorance and suffering. So preoccupied with my thoughts, I paid no attention to my route and got onto 295, as I normally would, to get back to Washington. When I noticed another police helicopter above me, I remembered the reason for my earlier detour. But this time, although the helicopter seemed to stick with me, I did not encounter any sign of an accident. They must be looking for someone, I thought as I pulled into my office garage later that day. I was interrupted by an incoming text message on my smartphone. To my surprise, it was from the First Lady urgently needing to meet privately that evening. Come to the intersection of Good Hope Road and 16th Street at 8:00 p.m. If I am late, please wait for me. SHP, the message read. What the hell does that mean? I asked myself, why would the First Lady meet with me again, and why is this all a secret? What's going on? However, I sent a confirming response, then tried to call Emily to let her know I would be late, but only received her voicemail, so I left a message without elaborating. I then tried to occupy myself with the work that had accumulated during my absence, drinking a few cups of coffee at my desk to stave off hunger. When it was time to go to my mysterious meeting, I went down to the garage and entered the specified address into the GPS system of my BMW. As I drove, my mind was filled with speculation as to why the First Lady might want to meet me under such mysterious circumstances. The more I thought about it, the less I could come up with any convincing reason. Suddenly I looked around and assessed my location. The GPS system led me to the heart of Anacostia, one of the most seedy areas of the capital. Why the hell did the First Lady choose such a meeting place? I asked myself. Nevertheless, I continued driving until I reached the intersection. The intersection of 16th Avenue and Good Hope Road was desolate and I wasn't sure which corner I should wait at. I decided to park on Good Hope in front of several darkened buildings. By that hour it was dark and the few working street lamps provided only limited illumination. I felt extremely vulnerable sitting in a parked car in that area, so I left the engine running and the doors locked. Every few minutes a car passed through the intersection, but none of them stopped or even slowed down. Otherwise the street seemed deserted. There was no sound, except the distant hum of a propeller-driven plane checking my watch. I asked myself how long will I have to wait, but I knew that I was not going to refuse a meeting with the First Lady, although it was already later than the appointed time. As I sat there, I became increasingly aware of how much coffee I had drunk and soon began to squirm uncomfortably in my seat. After looking around, I did not see a place where there could be a public toilet, so I decided to step out and relieve myself. But after a minute I realized that waiting was no longer an option. If I didn't want to meet the president's wife in wet trousers, I had to go now, cursing. I jumped out of the car and walked slightly bent into an alley between two dilapidated buildings. I found a spot in the dark shadows behind a pile of trash bags, and zipped my fly and began to relieve myself. I'm just like some damn homeless person. I scolded myself, looking around to make sure no one was watching. Just as I finished, a shadowy figure darted across the street and opened my car door. At one point, a man jumped behind the wheel and started the engine. "Hey!" I shouted hastily, buttoning my fly, "get out of my car," as my BMW began to pull away from the side of the road. I turned to run after it, but only managed to take a couple of steps before a body slammed into me, knocking me back into a pile of trash bags. I tried to push the body away from me, only to recoil in surprise when my hands touched a woman's breasts before I could say a word. A hand covered my mouth and a woman's voice whispered in my ear, "Be quiet and don't move." When the woman loosened her grip, I said, "My car. You're stealing my car, forget about the car." I heard in response, "If I'm not mistaken." What she was about to say was interrupted by a hissing roar, accompanied by a streak of light that directly hit the driver of my car. There was a powerful explosion and the woman pounced on top of me, even through her body. I felt the impact of the explosion, which was immediately followed by a wave of intense heat. A large piece of metal flew over my head and hit the brick wall directly above us. When the noise died down, I struggled to raise my head, and when I did, I saw that there was almost nothing left of my car except burning wreckage. Looking on in amazement, I saw a burning tire rolling down Good Hope Road. I was in shock, but the woman who attacked me was moving with purpose. She grabbed a large metal fragment and lifted it on her arm. She then turned and began to pull me along with her. "Come on," she said urgently. "Stay in the shadows as much as possible. I don't think they can use infrared after the explosion, so we should be fine." "Wait, where are we going? What's going on?" I asked, confused. "There's no time to explain now. The damn thing is still up there. Besides, they've probably already sent a team to the site to confirm the kill." Confused, I followed the woman down an alley past several buildings until we reached UST Street. The woman dragged me to a car park there, and as soon as I fastened my seatbelt, she sped off without turning on her headlights. With the streetlights passing by, I recognized the woman as Evelyn Hughes. As the shock slowly wore off, it was replaced by anger. What the hell was that, I demanded to know. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road, occasionally glancing up through the windshield to try to see the sky. I'd say it was a Hellfire missile launched from a Predator drone, laser-guided, probably a 20-pound warhead. "You should feel honored. They brought out the big guns on you," she explained as I was processing everything that had just happened. My eyes suddenly widened. "What about that poor guy who stole my car?" I asked. Evelyn shrugged. "One less thief from Washington." She noted Riley, then glancing at me and seeing the expression on my face, she apologized. "Sorry for being flippant. This is really serious and I'm just as shocked as you are." I wasn't satisfied. Easy for you to say it was your boss who arranged for me to be killed. Tonight, Evelyn braked sharply and pulled the car to the side of the road. Angry, she turned to me. Mrs. Stevens had absolutely nothing to do with it. The text you received was not from her. Seeing the disbelief on my face, she continued. Come on, Michael. Who ever heard of the First Lady setting up a meeting like this? She never sends text messages. Hell, I'm not even sure she knows how. And I looked down. She started the car again and continued driving. Suddenly my head shot up and I turned to the agent. Wait a minute. Are you following me in that alley? Are you following me? Evelyn nodded. Actually, I've been keeping an eye on you for a few days now. Mrs. Stevens asked me to keep an eye on you. Really, I never noticed you. I said in surprise. She smiled. I didn't want you to notice me. I wasn't satisfied. What about that helicopter I saw the other day? Was that you? The smile disappeared from the agent's lips. I wasn't the only one watching you, Michael. As the adrenaline began to subside, I sank into my seat, trembling slightly. I don't understand what's going on anymore. Evelyn, I said quietly. My life has gotten crazy and I don't understand why this is happening. She looked at me and reached out to squeeze my hand. I don't know either, Michael, but I think I can take you somewhere safe where we can try to figure it out. A few minutes later, Evelyn arrived at a house on Foxhall Road north of Georgetown. When we arrived at the gate after she introduced herself, the gate quietly opened to let us in. Where are we? I asked, in surprise. This is Senator Hamilton's house. He's Mrs. Stevens' father. I think you'll be safe here. They probably think you were driving your car. Even if they don't, I don't think anyone dares to carry out a drone strike on the home of a U.S. senator. Evelyn explained. Evelyn led me to the door, where we were greeted by the butler, who was obviously expecting us. He led us into a room that appeared to be the breakfast room, although it was larger than my living room. Sandwiches and mugs of beer were waiting for us at the table. Although I was not thinking about food, I realized that I was hungry and Evelyn and I began to eat with gusto during our meal. Evelyn deliberately tried to steer the conversation away from the events of the evening. When it became clear that she would not talk about the attack, I asked Evelyn to tell me her story. She smiled. Actually, it's a pretty short story. I'm from the prairies like you. My dad was a rancher in Montana and I got a rock scholarship to Bozeman State University. After graduation, I enlisted in the army and was sent to Afghanistan where I was assigned to the military police. After I served my time, I tried my luck with the Secret Service. They gave preference to veterans and women, so I ended up here in Washington immediately. Mrs. Stevens appeared around the corner and Evelyn and I stood up. The First Lady quickly walked up to me and grabbed both of my hands. I'm so glad you're safe, Michael. It really upset me that my name was used to lure you into a trap, even though I didn't know it at the time. She said she sat down at the table with us looking at me. She said, I still don't understand what's going on, but it seems like you've attracted an unusual amount of attention from several agencies of the federal government. I can only assume that your visit to Drive Lewis somehow triggered these events. But why should anyone care about a couple who lost a child due to miscarriage? I asked. I don't know, the First Lady repeated, but I kind of think the answer must be Lincoln Medical Center. If I'm right, there are two things I know about that place that might help you. She continued first. In addition to being arguably the best hospital in the country, Lincoln Medical Center is also a leading biomedical research center, especially in the field of DNA research. What is not as widely known is that, in connection with their research, they have records of the DNA of every patient they've treated over the last 10 years. That includes the DNA of every child and every fetus they've ever treated. Thinking about the implications of what Mrs. Stevens was saying, my eyes widened, but before I could say anything, the First Lady continued. Second, I am a trustee of Lincoln Medical Center. I believe I can get you access to information that would otherwise not be available, at least without a court order. I involuntarily turned my gaze to Evelyn, who was just as amazed as I was. "Please be my guest tonight," Mrs. Stevens continued. "I think you'll be safe here. Besides, as far as I've been able to gather, the authorities believe you were the driver of the car." She smiled. "Riley, it will take them some time to collect. Enough remains to realize their mistake." I shuddered involuntarily. "Evelyn," Mrs. Stevens continued, "tomorrow I want you to take Michael to the Lincoln Medical Center Genetic Resource Center. I've already made a couple of calls that should pave the way. Maybe you can find out enough to stop the little war that seems to be playing out on the streets of the capital." She smiled at both of us in the meantime. "I recommend that you get a good night's sleep. My father has enough bedrooms that no one will disturb you." We both said goodbye to the First Lady and then headed upstairs to the sleeping quarters. As I began to turn the doorknob to my room, I suddenly stopped. "Oh God, Evelyn, I'm sorry," I exclaimed. "What are you sorry for?" she asked. In bewilderment and all this madness and confusion, "I never thanked you for saving my life," I said. With these words I hugged her. Evelyn stepped back to look me in the face. "I was just doing my job, Michael," she said seriously. Then her face broke into a smile. "But I really liked it. And you felt me up there in the alley," she added, suddenly leaning over to give me a quick kiss on the cheek. She then turned and walked into her bedroom, leaving me standing there in amazement. The next morning Mrs. Stevens joined us again for breakfast, and while we ate she had news for us. "I did a little digging this morning. You'll be interested to know that the Washington Post is reporting yesterday's incident as a gas tank explosion," she said with a mirthless smile. "The driver has not yet been publicly identified, but it's significant that your surveillance appears to have been lifted." Evelyn and I exchanged dark glances. The First Lady had more to say. "Since they don't seem to be looking for you anymore, let's not give them a reason to reconsider their decision. I still think you should go to Lincoln Medical Center, but let's switch roles for your visit. Evelyn, I need you to be my assistant this morning. I made a few calls and they're waiting for you at the Genetic Resource Center. Michael, you'll be Evelyn's driver. You can use one of my dad's cars. I hope it doesn't cause any unwanted attention." After breakfast, I put on a dark jacket and chauffeur's cap, and raising my hat, I hurried to open the door for Evelyn, who acknowledged my nod with a broad smile. As we set off, I looked at Evelyn. My face took on a serious expression. "I still don't understand why we're going back to Lincoln Medical Center or what exactly we're looking for. Do you know?" Evelyn kept in a circle a large envelope of information that Mrs. Stevens had given her. "Mrs. Stevens has a list of information we should request from GRCF. Hopefully the answers will help us understand what's going on. Let's focus on getting help from the hospital for now. Then we'll figure out what to do about it." When we finally found the GRCF in the maze of buildings that made up Lincoln Medical Center, a worn brick exterior hid the advanced work going on inside. A researcher was already waiting for us at the check-in counter, leading us down a long corridor. He said, "I have been tasked with helping you with whatever you need." When we reached a small waiting room in front of a much larger laboratory, Evelyn explained that they needed a DNA test on me, who looked surprised by this turn of events. Nevertheless, I agreed to have my hair sample taken, but before the researcher could leave, Evelyn handed him a second bag containing another hair sample. "Well, need to test this sample as well. Please then we'll need to compare both samples to the DNA from those two samples which I assume you already have on file. We need a probability of a relationship for everyone with that." She handed the man a piece of paper with 2 long alphanumeric codes on it. The researcher looked at the numbers and, recognizing the standard DNA sample identification numbers for the facility, nodded in understanding and quickly left the room. I turned to Evelyn with confusion. "Wouldn't it take days, if not weeks, to test these samples and compare them?" I asked. "That would be true under normal circumstances. Evelyn replied, but we are in a cutting-edge research facility with capabilities that most DNA labs don't have. And don't forget the request for help came from a hospital trustee. Mrs. Stevens thinks that they can give us results within an hour and a half. I whistled in admiration, but had other questions. So what were those numbers you gave him, and where did that other hair sample come from? Instead of answering, Evelyn glanced toward the corner of the room, and as I followed her gaze, I noticed the CCTV camera. Evelyn then shook her head, signaling me not to ask any more questions. Time passed as slowly for us as it did for any patient stuck waiting at the doctor's office. But finally the researcher returned and handed Evelyn an envelope. I think you will find everything you need here. Give our regards to Mrs. Stevens and let her know if you were satisfied with our answer. Oh, we're definitely satisfied, Evelyn said with a grateful smile. And we'll be sure to let Mrs. Stevens know about your help with that. Evelyn and I left the facility and began our trek back to the capital. While I drove, Evelyn kept the envelope containing the information on her lap, and although I was eager to know the contents, she cautioned me to wait until we were back at Hamilton's hideout. When we finally passed through the gate, we hurried toward the house. The butler met us at the door and led us into the living room. Here we found Mrs. Stevens waiting for us. Evelyn handed the envelope to the First Lady, who carefully opened it. She pulled out the sheets of paper and looked at them thoughtfully. She then handed them to me, who looked at them blankly before passing them back to Mrs. Stevens. I don't understand any of this. What does it mean? I asked cautiously. The First Lady held up one of the sheets so I could see it. Subject toe. She said softly, this is your DNA. The alphanumeric code you see below is the DNA number of the fetus your wife aborted about 2 years ago. Analysis shows that you were the father of this fetus. At her words I couldn't help but sigh heavily. I was afraid I thought it could have been someone else's child. I said then, as the two women looked at me, I suddenly realized the consequences and my relief turned to anger. But this means that she aborted my child. Why would she do this? I wanted a child so bad, we both wanted it. Tears began to form in my eyes and I wiped them away angrily. I glanced at Evelyn and Mrs. Stevens, who were sitting quietly noticing the solemn expression on their faces. I pointed to the second sheet. What does this say? I demanded. This is the DNA code of the fetus that Emily miscarried during the Easter egg roll. The analysis excludes subject A as the father, but confirms the paternity of subject B. Mrs. Stevens explained. How can it be? I asked, angry and confused. Then a dark expression appeared on my face. Who is subject B? Where did this hair sample come from? I asked angrily. Mrs. Stevens looked at me with worried eyes. I'm afraid I'm responsible for this. Michael, she said quietly. I took this sample from my husband's hair, Trish. I looked at her incredulously. My wife is the president's mistress. Did she carry his child? I fell onto the sofa, my shoulders slumping as if weighed down by a heavy weight. Tears flowed freely now, as the shock of the revelations mixed with the tension I had been under 4 weeks. Evelyn came and sat next to me and took my hand, and Mrs. Stevens came over to get me some tissues. After a while I regained control of myself and looked at them with determination in my eyes. Evelyn sensed this and quickly asked in a worried voice, what are you going to do now, Michael? I'm going to go home and meet my future ex-wife, Evelyn, I said. Evelyn looked worriedly at the First Lady, who quickly spoke. Michael, I would feel a lot better if you stayed here. I'm not sure yet that it's safe for you to be outside the house. I wouldn't want to hear about another accident, she said. I looked at her, then at Evelyn, who nodded vigorously. Okay, I admitted. I'll call her. It's killing me. I can't hold it in anymore. The two women exchanged glances. Evelyn then reached into her bag and pulled out her cell phone. Use this. She told me this is a disposable phone that has never been used, so this number should not raise an alarm at the NSA. Handing me the phone, she added, but don't talk for long. Just in case. I took the phone and walked out onto the PTH patio behind the house. but I dialed Emily's cell phone. It rang for a while before a hesitant female voice answered. Yes. Who is? It's me. Michael. The husband you thought was dead. I said Michael. She squealed. I was so worried about you. Where have you been? I tried to call you, but I only got a recording. I don't want to go through the couple in love routine with you anymore. I know everything about you and your lover, and I know whose baby it was when you miscarried. I also know that it was my child that you aborted 2 years ago. But Michael, Emily objected. I interrupted her again. I don't want to hear any more of your lies, and I sure as hell don't want to hear any more excuses. I just want you to know that as soon as I can start filing the paperwork, I will be filing for divorce. Oh, and in case you were wondering, I won't be filing a lawsuit based on irreconcilable differences. I added that would be adultery to the fullest extent. Michael. Wait. Emily begged me, don't do anything hasty. We need to talk. Please. Why, so you can let another drone deal with me? Do you want this? I asked angrily. What are you talking about? I don't know anything about any drones. She said heatedly. Okay. Have it your way. I said angrily. But either way, I want you out of my life as quickly as possible. Just wait until tomorrow. She pleaded. Don't do anything. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my wife if you ever were. I said bitterly, and you can task me for anything now or ever again. But thus I hung up, wanting to find a way to turn off the cell phone. When I returned inside, Evelyn was waiting. How was it? She asked sympathetically. Pretty much what you'd expect. I said it was all denial and delay. I didn't know anything. We need to talk. Take your time, I said, meandering Emily's excuses, seeing the play of emotions on my face. She took my hand and led me inside to the den. You need to try to take your mind off all this chaos. For a while there's a ball game on EV. Watch it with me. We'll see how bad the Nationals are this season. I made us some sandwiches and thought I saw some imported beer in the fridge. Evelyn suggested. I reluctantly allowed her to take charge. But to my surprise, after a while I felt myself relaxing while watching the game. I even exchanged snarky comments with her about how instant replay was ruining the game. For the most part, I found myself able to compartmentalize my emotions. The only time the pain threatened to come out was when I had to watch commercials depicting happy families. Evelyn wisely did not try to interfere, but gently steered me back to more harmless topics when the opportunity presented itself. At the end of the evening, Evelyn walked me back to my room. At the door, she hugged me. Things will get better, Michael. I promise you took the first step by knowing the truth. Now at least you know what you're dealing with. I hope you're right, Evelyn, I said. She stood and watched sympathetically as I closed the door. She knew that I would have to wait a long time for sleep. The next morning the two of us were having breakfast when the butler suddenly appeared. There's a gentleman from the Federal Bureau of Investigation standing at the door. He said solemnly he says he'd like to talk to Mr. Phillips. What should I tell him? Evelyn and I looked at each other. Then a determined look appeared on my face. I'll be right there, I said. Wait a second, Evelyn said, and put on a shoulder holster with a black Sig Sauer. She then followed me to the door and stopped where her weapon was visible. The man at the front door waited patiently, with his hands folded in front of him. When I opened the door, the man showed me his credentials and politely asked Mr. Jacob Phillips. When I acknowledged him, the agent continued, Sir, the President of the United States would like to see you at the White House immediately. I was ordered to take you there. I looked at Evelyn again and she said something to me. I'm ready to go to the White House right now, I told the man, but I prefer my own transportation. The agent shrugged. As you wish, sir, he said, turned and left Evelyn, and I quickly got ready and rushed towards Pennsylvania Avenue. I don't think they'll do anything right now, she told me, but I'm going to go the most public route. It won't hurt to be on the safe side. I wonder how they knew where I was, I asked. I think we underestimated how badly they wanted to find you. Evelyn said they must have held a full-blown press conference right after your call to Emily. Yesterday, when we got to the White House, the agent we met earlier was waiting for us. Evelyn reached out and squeezed my hand. "Good luck," she said, and then I walked up the steps to the entrance. The agent led me through ornate hallways until we turned into a small office with nothing inside except a desk and what looked like an airport metal detector your mobile phone. "Please," the agent asked. I reluctantly handed it over because I hoped to record my meeting with the president. The agent then asked, "Are you wearing a wire?" I shook my head. "Any electronic devices?" "Again?" I said, "No." "Do you have a pacemaker?" "No," I said. "What is it?" I asked, pointing to a device next to the table, with a sly grin. The agent said, "If you have any kind of electronic device, this baby will fry it and maybe you too." I nervously walked through it, but without incident. The agent then led me down the hallway and held the door open so I could enter what was undoubtedly the Oval Office. "Come in and sit down. The president will be with you soon." The agent said. I walked over to one of the chairs in front of the president's desk and sat down. After a moment I began to look around. Even though Emily had worked as an assistant to the president for half a dozen years, I had never seen the Oval Office before, and I couldn't help but marvel at being in the seat of world power. It's easy to understand how one can get carried away by all this. I thought at that moment the door behind me opened, and when I turned to look, I saw the unmistakable figure of Michael Stevens walking towards me. Even though I now hated the man standing before me, I automatically stood out of instinctive respect for the position Stevens held. The president didn't offer to shake my hand or say a word. Instead, he invited me to follow him. We walked through a door I hadn't even noticed, through the lobby, out a second door, and suddenly found ourselves in the bright sunlight of a late spring day on the back lawn of the White House. "This is the best place for us to talk," the president said, but when I began to answer, the big man raised his hand in silence. He then spoke seemingly out in the open. "Don't write it down. This conversation is privileged, private and confidential." I looked around but didn't see anything that could record our conversation. Then the president walked and I hurried out after him. I liked this side of it. Stevens said, "Everyone talks about the Rose Garden, but at this time of year I think the Kennedy Garden is more beautiful." I looked at the taller man and said bluntly, "I don't think you called me here to discuss spring flowers." "Mr. President," Stevens grinned slightly, "we don't need to beat around the bush with you." "Michael." "Well, you're right. Of course, I brought you here to talk about Emily." I felt anger boiling inside me. "I know everything about you and Emily," I said hotly. "You don't know a damn thing." The president spat back. "But I do know you tried to kill me with a drone strike, so you could take her for yourself," I replied. The president's anger subsided and an expression of almost embarrassment appeared on his face. "I'm sorry about that, Michael. It was a mistake. I got upset and said some harsh things about you in the company of the wrong people. I think they took me too seriously." I stared at him and then said sarcastically, "Oh, of course I understand. Just like Henry I and Thomas Becket." Seeing Stevens looking at me in confusion, I continued, "You know, when the king asked his minions, 'Will no one rid me of this annoying priest?' Stevens replied dismissively, 'Anyway, I brought you here to talk about my heritage. I've accomplished almost everything I set out to achieve, and I think history will treat me very well indeed. But the only thing I'm missing is an heir, and unfortunately my wife is barren. That's why I need Emily.'" "Wait. I counted if you weren't happy with your wife. Why didn't you just divorce her?" Stevens looked at me like I was the village idiot. "Divorce her? Do you know how many votes her father has in the Senate? Without Horace Hamilton's support, I would never have been able to get my agenda through Congress. Hell, I never would have gotten this nomination." My first reaction was contempt, but then suddenly, what the president had said dawned on me and I was shocked. "Nomination?" I asked. "Even during the primaries, how long has this thing been going on between you and Emily?" An expression of satisfaction appeared on the president's face. "We fell in love during my first party nomination, even before she met You have to admit we did a good job keeping this a secret. He said proudly. I was stunned. But why did Emily marry me if you were both in love with each other? Now Stevens grinned openly. Don't you see? You were the perfect cover. She could be working next to me all this time, and since you two are married, no one would suspect anything but your wife. The Secret Service, the media, I countered. How could you get together without people knowing about it? Stevens winked at me. There are places away from the Secret Service rooms without wires trips abroad. Even on Air Force One it didn't happen that often. But we managed. His expression suddenly sobered. But you kept pushing Emily to start a family, and she finally agreed to go off the pill to make you happy. What you didn't know was that she started using a diaphragm whenever you wanted to have sex. They say these things are 94 effective. I think 2 years ago you and Emily were in that 6 anyway, when she got pregnant. We knew the baby wasn't mine because of the timing, so we arranged for her to have an abortion, the one you learned about at Lincoln Medical Center. I felt dizzy as I tried to understand everything. Stevens was telling me she was on birth control this whole time, but this can't be true. She got pregnant last winter. I said. Stevens could barely contain himself. I said she used the diaphragm with you. I didn't say she used it with me. After her abortion, we decided we couldn't risk another accident, so we moved up the schedule to give me my heir. Our plan would have worked perfectly if she had a miscarriage. I stood there with my mouth open. I simply could not understand that my entire marriage had been a sham, and that the woman I thought loved me had deceived me so for so long. Stevens started walking again, and I had to scramble to catch up with him. Anyway, it's all in the past. I want to talk about the future. I don't want to hear any more talk from you about divorce. Everything will remain the same. You and Emily will remain married soon. She will become pregnant again, and you will act like a proud father. Either way, Emily will get pregnant, and you two will raise the child as your own for the next 2 years. Then, after I finish my second term in office, I will quietly divorce Samantha, and you and Emily will separate. She will have sole custody of the child after a decent amount of time. Emily and I will get married, and I will adopt the child and change his name to Stevens. I've planned it all. I stared at the big guy, wondering if he was crazy. What makes you think I would ever collude with you in this crazy scheme? Why don't I leave today and go straight to the Washington Post and just tell them the whole story? I demanded angrily. The president gave me a piercing look. Over the years, I've realized that if you want to achieve something, it's better to use both the carrot and the stick. So tell me, Michael, would you agree with me if I could make your wildest dream come true? What if I gave you the dream of almost every lawyer in the country, as well as a guarantee of financial security for the rest of your life? I was completely confused and looked at Stevens incomprehensibly. The big guy was now on a roll. He took me by the shoulder and pointed toward the south lawn. Look over there through the trees at Constitution Avenue. This is the Ministry of Justice. How would you like your oil portrait to hang there? Michael, the current AG still wants to retire. How would you like to be my Attorney General? Over the next 2 years, you will be the most senior legal advisor in the country, and when the new president is sworn in, every law firm in the country will gladly hire you at an astronomical salary. Or if that's not the life you want, you could probably become the dean of almost any law school you like. The world would be your oyster. All you have to do is keep everything exactly as it was for 2 more years, and it could all be yours. What do you say? Before I could respond, a figure emerged from the White House and waved frantically at the president. Stevens nodded and turned back to me. I have to go. I made the French ambassador wait for more than 30 minutes. He chuckled slightly. All this would be much easier if I were the president of France. They have a completely different attitude toward matters of the heart than we do in this country. In any case, think about what I suggested with these words. The big man left for the meeting, leaving me standing among the FLRs in Kennedy's garden. Then an FBI agent appeared, and after returning my cell phone, led me back through the White House to where Evelyn was waiting impatiently in the car. After I got into the car, It pulled away from the side of the road and soon found itself in midday traffic. "Well, what did he want? What did he say?" she asked impatiently. I looked up the windshield with a thoughtful expression on my face. "I have a lot to think about," I said 3 months later. The reporter stood on the steps of the Senate building, listening intently to the tiny speaker in her ear. And she heard the producer's line. She began speaking to the camera in front of her. "This is CNN News reporting live from Capitol Hill, where the Judiciary Committee will soon begin confirmation hearings for Jacob Phillips. As is widely known, it's confirmed, Phillips would become the youngest Attorney General in U.S. history. But with President Stevens' support, these hearings became a mere formality." She pressed her fingers to her ear and then said, "I was told that the hearings are already underway. So we will now go live to the Senate floor where the hearings are taking place." The hearing room was filled with the sounds of people taking their seats and exchanging hushed comments. I was sitting at the table facing the panel of senators. Looking back, I saw Emily sitting behind me, her belly already beginning to show. She smiled and gave me a thumbs up. At this point, Senator Horace Hamilton, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, called the meeting to order and announced that the nominee had requested an opportunity to make brief initial remarks. As he gestured, I cleared my throat and leaned toward the microphone in front of me. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Judiciary Committee, I'm honored to appear before you as a nominee for Attorney General of the United States of America. Every lawyer in the country dreams of one day holding this important position, and I can assure you that I am no exception. The purpose of this hearing, of course, is for you to learn more about me, my legal philosophy and my influence. It is this last topic that I would like to talk about now, but instead of legal scholars or political scientists, the influence I would like to mention is the poet T.S. Eliot and especially his masterpiece Murder in the Cathedral." I heard noise in the room. Bob continued. "As you of course know, the play tells the story of the murder of Archbishop Thomas Beck by agents of Henry II, because Thomas disobeyed the will of the king. But the crime was not the play's main focus. Instead, Eliot wanted us to confront the theme of temptation. You see, Becket had options before the murder, some of which could have brought him fame, power, wealth or security, but Becket rejected them all, declaring that the greatest treason is doing the right thing for the wrong reason. I think Becket and Eliot were right. It is a sin to do the right thing for the wrong reason, and for this reason I hereby withdraw my candidacy for the position of Attorney General. I do this because my candidacy was not a recognition of merit or ability, but a cold, calculated bribe that I cannot and will not accept." There was shouting in the room as photographers pushed each other to take pictures, but Senator Hamilton restored order and motioned for me to continue. "You are probably asking yourself why I waited so long to reject this nomination and why I chose such a public forum to do so. The answer is that it was the only way to be sure of what I should do to say what cannot be suppressed," Edenor explained. "It is vital that I have this opportunity, because I hereby charge Michael Arthur Stevens, President of the United States, with high crimes and misdemeanors." A collective gasp filled the Senate chamber, followed by screams from the media and angry outbursts from many of the senators present. But the chairman once again called for order, and at his signal, the microphones of the remaining senators were turned off. He then calmly encouraged me to continue. "Ladies and gentlemen, these are my charges. The President authorized the use of a military drone to attack a U.S. citizen on United States soil. If not for the interference of others, he would have succeeded. The President acted illegally because he maintained an intimate relationship with my wife for a long time, trying to get an heir. When I got too close to the truth about this relationship, he tried to kill me. When this attempt failed, he tried to buy my silence by offering me the post of Attorney General. Regardless of whatever investigations this Congress makes or whatever decisions it makes on these matters, I will file for divorce from my wife, Emily, on the ground of adultery, and I will name the President as a co-defendant. These are extremely serious allegations and you have every reason to doubt their veracity. Accordingly, I now intend to hand over the evidence gathered over the past 3 months to the members of the committee and the ladies and gentlemen of the media. In the first section, you will find irrefutable DNA evidence of an intimate relationship between the president and my wife. In the second section, you'll find the evidence we developed regarding the DC drone attack, including a photo of the tail of the Hellfire missile that was fired at me in the Anacostia area. As you will see, the serial number and other markings have been preserved, allowing us to pinpoint its source and details of its use. Evelyn, could you give it away? Evelyn Hughes nodded and gave me a tight smile before she began handing out envelopes. There was an immediate riot as senators and reporters rushed to take one of the envelopes. I looked back at my wife, and was desperately trying to avoid the questions of the reporters surrounding her. Then I looked at Senator Hamilton. Mr. Chairman, I said, this concludes my opening remarks. The senator looked at me and nodded. Then the old man looked into the gallery. I followed his gaze and noticed the First Lady standing with her arms crossed at the entrance to the highest level of the room. And she saw the two of us looking at her. She nodded to us with grim satisfaction and then retreated through the doorway behind her after finishing filling up the tank. I went to the gas station to pay the attendant. These days I mostly use cash rather than credit cards, staying off the grid as much as possible. They knew they could still find me if they wanted, but I didn't want to make it easy. I was driving instead of flying for the same reason. I hadn't checked the news for several days, but when I noticed a copy of USA Today on the counter, I impulsively took a copy. The front page featured a large photograph of a wooden accessories co-op. I laughed mockingly. I always wanted to be in the history books. Looks like my wish came true. As I walked out, I looked at the blue cloudless sky in the west. It had become a habit, but today I saw nothing but an about email overhead. Nevertheless, I quickly stepped onto the roof above the pumps. I returned to the car and passed a can of ice cold soda through the open window. Thank you. Evelyn said, how long until we get to Nebraska? I looked out over the flat prairie plain before us. I'd say we have another hour before we reach the Missouri River. I told her when I got into the car and started the engine. She squeezed mine with concern. Any doubts about coming back here? Michael, after all, Stephen still has friends in Oklahoma. I smiled at her. I'm not worried. The Cornhuskers and Sooners have always been rivals. Then I became serious. Besides, do you know what the Nebraska state motto is? When she shook her head, I told her equality before the law. Nebraskans don't like officials who think they are above the law. Hear the uproar in Washington. Okay, but I'm still worried about you, she said. I reached out and squeezed her. And you're fine as long as you have my back.